Welcome to S&C's Power Up webinar on packaging an important question. Is federal energy policy ignoring the distribution grid? My name is Spencer Zirkelbach, and I will be your host for today's webinar. And want to start off by saying thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We have a wide range of attendees from the US government, Department of Energy, electric utilities, regulators, and industry organizations. We want to make this webinar a great use of your time, which we believe starts with getting our audience's input on today's topic. And we'll be doing this through polls during the webinar that we encourage you to participate in. We're going to start right away and we'd like your perspectives of the biggest challenges to achieving a cleaner and smarter grid. You'll see this poll come up in just a moment. And we encourage you all to respond as we go through some administrative items and introduce our panelists. On the administrative side, this webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be shared after the event along with a brief survey. We would greatly appreciate a few seconds of your time to provide feedback on today's content. Attendee microphones are muted, and we have turned off the chat feature. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions you have throughout this webinar. We will address all questions at the end of the webinar. Finally, if you have any technical difficulties, you can also use the Q&A function, and a member of the S&C team will help you. Now that we have those out of the way, let me introduce our panelists who will be sharing their expertise with us. First off, we have Brian Levitt, who is the author of the book, Energy Resilient Buildings and Communities, A Practical Guide, and is a Regulatory Affairs Director at S&C. We are honored to be joined by Philip Moeller, the Executive Vice President of the Business Operations Group and Regulatory Affairs at the Edison Electric Institute. Prior to his time at EEI, Philip was the second longest serving member of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and led the Washington, D.C. office of Alliant Energy Corporation. Finally, we are very pleased to have Phil Square, who is the Vice President of Government Relations at the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. In this important role, he leads NEMA's team of advocacy professionals dedicated to achieving the industry's policy objectives at all levels of government. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your time with this group today. Now I'm going to share the poll results and turn it over to Phil Square to talk a little bit about what we've learned in these. So I'm ending the polling and going to share the results. So Phil, do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Well, considering that I operate in the policy world, I'm not surprised that the bipartisan policy agreement came out as the top challenge. This is clearly one of the things that is motivating many policymakers, both in Congress and in the agencies. There's great anticipation that changing, updating, revising American policy related to the electric grid, transmission, distribution systems, utility regulation, and what have you, all those things are wrapped up in some very high importance discussions right now on Capitol Hill. So very pleased about that. I also am not surprised that the costs of infrastructure investments weighs in pretty heavily there. I think that the representatives from the utility sector might be better able to address the specific questions of that, but for that, maybe I could turn it over to Brian or Phil Moeller to make some additional comments.
Yeah, well, I'll let Phil talk to it, but I would, I mean, I agree with those as two big drivers. I would say that when we think about the cost of infrastructure investments, it's always important that we consider the cost of doing nothing. So you know, we need to make some expensive infrastructure investments, but we're going to talk today about some of the reasons why that is so critical. Phil Moeller, what's the utility perspective on those costs?
Well, Brian, you're exactly right. We're going to need major investments at the distribution level and the transmission level to make sure that we can make this transition occur. And I'll talk about it in my remarks later, but it's going to be a challenge because regulators are very concerned about cost. But as you said, the cost of doing nothing is higher than the cost of making these investments. It's a great poll question and interesting results.
Okay, I think I'm up first and appreciate moving on to the next slide, please. I'd just like to start with a quick public service announcement to let everybody know what the National Electrical Manufacturers Association is. We're a trade association of manufacturers in the electro industry, and we have about 325 companies in a very, very diverse technical and business areas of operation. Our companies make all the products that move electricity from the point that it's generated to the point that it's used, and cover utility systems, buildings, lighting, transportation, industrial automation, and related equipment. At heart, we're a standards development organization and work very closely with the American standards community. We have a very rigorous data and statistical program that helps companies benchmark where they stand in the marketplace. And of course, we're very active in the policy arena as well to advance positive ideas and to resist negative ones, and to try to help our companies grow and help America electrify to the extent that we can. One other interesting aspect of a trade association is that it provides a safe space or a neutral forum for manufacturers to talk together, to compare notes and discuss industry-wide issues. And so we're very, very pleased that vigorous and active conversations within NEMA happen in a lot of ways. Next slide, please. We're very active in a variety of different advocacy areas, as I mentioned. This is a listing of some of the major categories where we work. Energy and infrastructure and transportation is probably the one that gets the most headlines, but we're also very active working with our friends around the world to minimize trade disruptions and advance commerce. We're active in the cybersecurity and data policy areas. We're actually expanding our staff in that area and have spent a lot of time over the last year or two in working with the administration and others on the bulk power systems executive order. We're active with federal appropriations, trying to achieve as many as resources from the federal government supporting our industry. And we're very pleased that Congress adopted an energy efficient transformer rebate program last year. And so now we're working to fund that fully. And finally, we're very involved with state code adoption, in particular, the National Electrical Code and the International Energy Conservation Code. Those codes are definitely where the rubber meets the road for new regulations and new products. And so we want to make sure that electrification of society happens as efficiently and as safely as possible. And we do that through state code adoption. So as we talk about advocacy and working with the administration, I thought I'd put up a chart that I would like to give some kudos to the Washington Post for tracking very vigorously over the last 6 months or so, comparing how the various recent presidents have staffed up their administrations. And you can see that the Biden administration got kind of a slow start. The administration had a slow start in general, and so staffing up was in that way as well. But they have kind of kept on the slower pace through the summer. And that's something that we're watching very closely. I think that there are, in the energy space, for example, of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection Agency, they have been pretty successful in staffing themselves up. And so we've had some good conversations with them. But clearly the Biden administration is trending on the low side of staffing up their agencies and departments. Next slide. So as we approach the 117th Congress, this is a slide that sort of describes some of the major categories of activities that is happening and where NEMA is engaging. It started, of course, one of the largest pieces of legislation was enacted in March, and sort of the last tranche of COVID relief that extended some unemployment insurance and some other transfer payments in pandemic response. But attention of Congress has definitely turned to infrastructure. And the Biden administration had released its American Jobs Plan, which is a very significant proposal related to hard infrastructure like grid and roads, but also included what they consider human infrastructure. There were significant plans to assist the healthcare sector, additional funding for unemployment and training. And so that's been out there for a little while. And what you see, one of the dynamics on Capitol Hill is how the Democratic majorities on both the House and Senate side are trying to adopt the administration's program to the maximum extent that they can. But as we turn to infrastructure, what you've seen on the Senate side in particular is a bipartisan deal clocking in at about $1.2 trillion related to infrastructure. And it's a very broad proposal, covers roads and bridges, but also a variety of other areas of infrastructure. And that's a bipartisan agreement to spend a little over $1 trillion. And much of the discussion now in the Senate relates to whether or not enough Republicans will join the majority Democrats to move that legislation through. On the House side, the House passed a $715 billion surface transportation bill earlier this month, but that is primarily a roads and bridges type of infrastructure bill. It is not the kind of broad approach that NEMA favors. NEMA favors a comprehensive approach to infrastructure, which would include grid modernization, workforce assistance, smart manufacturing, buildings, provisions, lighting provisions, all transportation provisions as well, electric vehicle charging and such. And so the challenge for us continues to be whether or not Congress will have the wherewithal to go beyond roads and bridges and potholes and really envision what a future infrastructure for the United States could be as we move to electrify and reduce emissions across the economy. There are some other major proposals that are hanging out there tangentially related to infrastructure. In the tax area, there's some vigorous debate over climate. There's another minor infrastructure bill on the House side, and there's been some conversation about whether or not the United States is situated properly to compete with China. And so on the Senate, you see the Innovation and Competition Act being pressed, which would support the economy and research and competitiveness to the tune of a couple $100 billion. So there are a lot of activities going on the Hill, but I think it's fair to say that the best bet for grid modernization is on the Senate side. The House has not done that. They've only restricted their bill to surface transportation. And so today, even just today as we speak, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee is marking up a version of legislation that includes many aspects of grid modernization that we think would be very valuable. That bill was released last night, or at least a new version was released last night, about 500 pages long, a number of amendments. So it will be very interesting to see what comes out of the amendment process. But the Senate, as it's moving forward, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee has moved surface transportation legislation. The Energy Committee is moving a broader piece of legislation, which would probably be put together and form a component of the bipartisan agreement. And other committees may also have a role, such as the Banking Committee with their jurisdiction over transit. So here you see some of the major categories of activity where the Manchin Draft Energy Infrastructure Act would set new policy. And I think that these would be positive steps in the right direction. And NEMA has been very public about complimenting Senator Manchin on what his bill would do in these areas. Next slide, please. So in terms of time frame and other political considerations, as I mentioned, the House and the Senate have very, very narrow Democratic majorities. It's actually a tie in the United States Senate with Vice President Harris forming a tie-breaking vote. The House only has a handful of seats in making the Democratic majority, but that has not slowed them down from moving their legislative priorities forward. Senate Majority Leader Schumer has suggested that later this month, the bipartisan infrastructure deal will start reaching the Senate floor, which would be a positive development. But the other large thing that's hanging out there is a reconciliation bill, which is a procedural way to move the remaining Biden administration priorities through the U.S. Senate by a bare majority vote. And last night you saw an agreement of the Senate Democrats on the Budget Committee announcing plans to move a reconciliation bill at about $3.5 trillion. And so that reflects the human infrastructure policies that the Biden administration announced earlier this year. Speaker of the House Pelosi has publicly stated that the House will not take an infrastructure bill unless it's also accompanied with the reconciliation bill, the larger human infrastructure bill. So that's a wrinkle in the procedures that that may slow things down. Now, we're hoping that the negotiations over the substance and timing of these bills will take place during August at the staff level and subsequently with the principals. And I would expect that if we're going to have a positive result in this negotiations, that we'd see a final bill passed in October or November timeframe, hopefully before next year, because next year is an election year and things only get tougher to move when people are thinking about their reelections. So I think we're in reasonably good shape now. I hope that NEMA is successful in broadening the scope of infrastructure legislation, but there's a lot of work remaining to be done. So with that, I'd like to turn it back and thank you very much.
Hey, thanks so much, Phil. So we just heard about major developments at the federal level, also how the distribution grid is largely being underrepresented in those efforts. The goals of creating jobs, lowering emissions, and improving reliability and resilience lead us to support a myriad of solutions, both human and technical. At the end of the day, those solutions on both the distributed generation side and the customer side are going to need to be connected to and leveraged by the distribution grid itself. So I want to take a few minutes in the middle here to discuss why a focus on the distribution grid is going to be important for this transition before Phil Moeller discusses how we can make that happen. So I would like to, if you can put that poll back up, first I want to ask the audience another question. We're going to talk about why, what are the important capabilities of a modern electrical grid? Now this is multiple choice. Pick, if you want to pick a multiple, pick multiple, try to keep it to 3. But I want to see, what this group thinks we need in an electrical grid, because we've talked about what they're doing on Capitol Hill, some of the investment that's going to be made, but where those investments are made differs. Phil just walked us through a lot of different legislative efforts with a lot of different foci. So reliability and self-healing, enabling a consumer interaction, because we're going to have more of a prosumer energy grid where people are actually going to be able to contribute to the grid even at an individual level, supporting distributed energy resource integration, and some of these other options that we had up here on the poll. And let's see what we've got here. Well, a lot of folks said reliability and self-healing, which is good news to my company because that's what we do for a living. But I think that as we have looked at a lot of the challenges, the visible challenges to the grid of late, I mean, starting as early as, say, Hurricane Sandy, but even when we think about the wildfires in California, if we think about the resource supply issues we had during the winter in Texas ERCOT, the ongoing challenges we have down in Florida, dealing with a lot of hurricanes and tropical storms. Phil Moeller, what do you think? Is reliability and a self-healing grid, the right focus for investment right now?
Well, I think that's going to be a major area that we have to focus on going forward. I actually voted for customer interaction since as we electrify more of the economy, we have to make sure that customers are comfortable with the choices they make. That includes some technological investments. And we need to make sure that the pricing signals are correct so that we target the investments in the places that they're the most efficient going forward. And I'll speak to some of that in my remarks as well.
Well, a lot of that interaction is going to require a more and more digitized grid, Phil. And a highly digitized grid is increasingly vulnerable to cybersecurity issues. Phil Square, I want to know, you've got a lot of, NEMA's got a lot of experience thinking about cybersecurity issues. What do you think we need to do in terms, from a grid level, in terms of, or maybe a societal level, in terms of a policy focus on cyber?
Well, I think one of the examples that I would point to is the work that we've done to interact with the Department of Energy on the Bulk Power Systems Executive Order. The executive order was issued. There wasn't a whole lot of formal mechanisms for interaction with the manufacturing community. And so that was really the main point of what we were trying to accomplish in that issue, was to give us an opportunity. We can send materials in all the time. We can have calls with the policymakers, but what we really wanted was a formal opportunity to make sure that there was an ongoing line of communication between policymakers, utility companies, and the companies that are selling equipment that are being hung on the grid, that are being installed alongside those products. And so that was really what we wanted. And so I would say that type of ongoing relationship, where everybody knows exactly where everybody else is going and thinking, is really one of the most important aspects that we could have.
Thanks, Phil. And in terms of where everybody's going and thinking, that sort of leads into my little neck of the woods here, where I'm going to talk about how the changing grid has changing needs. So the grid we have today is not the grid we're going to need to in the future to accomplish a lot of our policy goals that we as a society have. Our grid was designed long ago to deliver centralized generation on one-way, largely overbuilt transmission and distribution lines. This system has been incredibly stable and reliable over the years, and our cost of service regulatory policies have enshrined this approach by basically telling utilities the best way to ensure approval of their rate case and ensure that that profit for their business is to propose replacements and upgrades that use traditionally accepted technologies and approaches. This creates sort of a gravitational center around the old school grid that you see on your slide right now. Today, we have different needs and new options to meet those needs. The best generation solutions are no longer necessarily centralized fossil fuel plants. We have large renewable energy projects that can deliver clean energy, but their intermittency has to be accounted for. And sometimes we have to think about how to get that energy from new places to our loads. So we need transmission lines in places to account for the changes in where we're generating and where we're using power. We have advanced switchgear and smart grid technologies that allow us to create a more reliable and resilient grid with less overbuilding of lines, which gets to your responses to one of our questions before. We have distributed generation that can produce electricity closer to the point of loads, but does require more advanced switching and protection to deal with that two-way power flow. Finally, we have non-wires alternatives and behind the meter solutions that allow us to mitigate peak demand and modulate loads to balance out the grid. So this linear grid we have is not the one we need. What our grid really needs to look like is something more like this. Instead of a linear grid, we need an integrated grid that leverages data analytics and smart grid infrastructure to make all of these new capabilities and technologies work together. This grid is flexible, not just in leveraging today's loads and generation, like distributed renewables, virtual power plants, but in preparing to leverage the grid for next steps, like grid scale energy storage and the elimination of the electrification of transportation and heating. This grid is also much more resilient, allowing for real-time grid reconfiguration, local energy usage, and microgrids to meet the rising threats of climate change and cyber attack. But a grid that looks like this is not a rate case slam dunk. Regulations are not designed to enable transition from the grid on the last slide to the grid on this slide. Even if it were, the cost of the change is probably going to be a lot to put on today's utility customers all at once. We need a thoughtful plan and of policy and regulation transition from the grid of the past to the grid of the future. Phil Mueller is going to talk a little bit more about what is needed after I talk a little bit more about why. So let's briefly explore the capabilities of the future resilient grid. As distributed energy increases, we have an increased need for two-way power flow. This is particularly important if we're going to leverage the capabilities of energy storage, electric vehicles, microgrids, and building-based renewables to provide power across laterals, feeders, and the entire grid. Individually, these technologies can all have some benefit to the carbon impact or energy costs or local demand management. But when leveraged as a collection of resources, their effect can be magnified and they can make the grid stronger and more resistant to things like physical damage, resource shortages, and price spikes. Let's not forget, when we think about the grid, we think a lot about the technology of the grid, but the grid is a marketplace. The grid of the future, even more so, a marketplace. And so we have to think about market threats, not just physical threats. So part of this comes from the fact that different parts of our grid have different needs at different times. Our load profiles don't all look the same. Our generation profiles differ. Dramatically overbuilding every part of the grid from supply to distribution is no longer a cost-effective approach. Now we need to leverage the ability to reshape the grid as we go with smart grid capabilities and project where the grid is going to be in the coming minutes and days with more advanced data analytics. We need the combination of all these green curves to meet the combination of all these blue curves in a way that is smart and malleable. Right now, we don't have smart or malleable, and utilizing all of these curves to their best advantage requires that. Now, when I say reshape the grid, I'm not talking about some incredible new technology that exists at one of our national labs. Instead, we need to think about the systematic and coordinated deployment of some well-proven technologies that allow us more flexibility in how and where we deliver power. So let's take a micro example of an outage on a utility ladder that I'm going to animate for you here. So we have our system, it is up and running, but we have a loss of source. In this case, it could be anything. In this case, I'm going to say that the wind has died down enough that some portion of our renewable energy, we've lost it. Okay, well, we can, in real time, identify the loss or the lowering of a source, reconfigure our grid to ensure that every aspect of that lateral is picked up. We're managing the load, and the grid can return to normal. As the source returns, the grid can return to its original state at which it is most balanced, and open certain switches so that we are protecting as much of our grid as possible. When we think about the kind of outages that a loss of source or that a line outage, things like that can cause, you don't want a system that is all openly connected at all times, because you can't balance that. And one problem on that system is going to cause problems for everybody. You need a segmented system so that people are, and loads, businesses are not affected by minor problems in other parts of the grid. But when minor parts of the grid, on other parts of the grid happen, that system can reconfigure and bring on as many people as possible and limit the problem to as small an area as possible. Let's talk for a minute. I've talked about changes in generation, changes in the grid. Let's talk about a new kind of load, electric vehicles. Passenger electric vehicles spread out amongst residential users around the country. It's probably not going to have a huge impact on grid operations. However, if we look at this data from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, we see that the market segments coming on the strongest are things like buses and light commercial vehicles. These vehicles are typically charged simultaneously at central depots. Now, my colleagues and I at S&C, we wondered how would this affect our utility customers' feeders. So we actually modeled some data from actual feeders of Canadian utility, and here's what we found. With unmanaged electric vehicle charging, a typical feeder with a reasonable amount of clustered EV fleet charging could experience considerable voltage drops and power quality challenges in the afternoon and early evening times. There are ways to prepare for this, but they require thought and they require regulatory support. In general, I want to end on this. In general, the best way to manage the grid of the future is not as individual pieces. It's not in a solar silo and an EV silo and a microgrid silo. If we can leverage local resources at the grid edge using distributed energy resource management systems, and at the distribution and transmission level as well, we can do more with fewer wires. We can do more with fewer resources. We can improve reliability while we are undergoing more threats to our reliability. It's about coordinating the strengths and use cases of these different technologies to work in harmony instead of working in silos. But the point I'm trying to make today is that doing all of this requires the grid as a system to be invested in. We have to go from the inflexible dumb grid to the nimble smart grid if we're going to leverage all the capabilities in the ways I've been discussing. And I think one of the things we're seeing from Capitol Hill is that there's a lot of focus on the buckets and the silos and not enough focus on the connective tissue, which is the grid itself. Now, we are going to talk about how do we fix that? What do we need? And Phil Moeller is going to come on and start with another one of our polling questions.
Well, there we go. Thank you, Brian. And poll 3, which policy is most important to developing the grid we need? Got a range of options there, and we will ask you to vote. In the meantime, I also want to suggest to the audience that you can use the Q&A feature to pose questions, and we hope that you will take advantage of that. I send thanks to the S&C team for inviting EEI to be part of this presentation, and obviously those in the audience who have an interest in these issues. As we wait for the poll results coming up, you can hopefully see them now. A vast majority of folks saying investment in smart grid technologies and infrastructure is the winner. Curious, Phil Square, what is your initial reaction to those numbers?
Well, speaking on behalf of the manufacturers of those products, I'm very happy to see that. I think that that's an acknowledgement, a clear acknowledgement that as effective as the grid is, it needs to continue to be built and it needs to continue to be modernized. So I think that 80% result is pretty clear that we seem to be pulling all in the same direction, or at least have the same views of what the major challenge in that area is.
Thank you. And Brian, I'm guessing you have a similar observation.
Well, I think this result is clearly a direct correlation between my persuasiveness as a speaker, Phil. No, but if we look at these things, maybe we didn't create enough apples to apples here, which is why we got sort of a lopsided response. Investment in smart grid technologies and infrastructure is a big deal, but I think that people who understand the way all this stuff works agree with the 80% of people who said that. I think that we need more of those voices in the policy and regulatory discussions. I will make a case for the energy resilience investments, the 10% of folks who put that up there, because we can have, we can build the best system in the world, but if we don't make it threat proof, it's going to fail us when we need it most. So I think that also has to stay top of mind.
Well, very good. And frankly, all of those answers would be appropriate. They're all important. And so it was kind of a tough question to answer, given the range of important policy issues. Again, I appreciate being invited to this webinar. In my brief remarks today, I'm going to tell you about EEI, but very briefly, talk about 4 buckets of legislation that we're kind of watching, move on to an initiative that we've started at EEI that I think is significant for this audience, and then talk about the regulatory aspect, both at FERC and at state commissions, which will be key to making sure that what we envision actually becomes reality. I think most of the people know that EEI is a trade association of investor-owned utilities. We call them energy companies now. We operate in all 50 states, have a lot of workers, and we also contribute 5% of the nation's GDP. And we often say we're the first 5%, because if you don't have electricity, not a lot of other things happen. I'll stay on this slide for a while, But as I mentioned, the 4 areas that we're particularly following related to Congress, the first would be kind of energy policy generally. And for those of you following it, you know that there's a lot of talk about a clean energy standard, and that might even be included in one of the reconciliation bills that they're talking about. As Phil Square pointed out, on all of these areas, the majority is so tight in the House that it'll be interesting to see if some kind of a moderate policy can be pushed the Republicans can back, as well as if the Democrats lose their far left members on this set of issues. So it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to get something through. But we generally embrace the clean energy standard. And part of it is because, at least with Representative DeGette's bill from Colorado, there is still a continued role for natural gas. I've been on a lot of conference calls and heard a lot of presentations from the administration on this set of issues. And the good news is that people are talking about it in DC. Energy policy is a big deal. It's a lot of buzz. And the green transition is one that I think is universally spoken about as important. It's happening. How to accelerate it is really the question. But the administration officials have been remarkably consistent in saying they want the end of fossil fuels by 2035. And we have politely and respectfully pushed back because we believe that we're going to need natural gas for quite a while to deal, particularly until we get long-term seasonal storage on the dealing with the intermittency of renewables. And natural gas provides that backdrop to maintain reliability and affordability as well. So watching where the clean energy standard goes, I think will be key to this audience going forward. Another area is generally the infrastructure set of issues. And again, Phil Square mentioned it earlier. There's a lot of talk on that. And generally speaking, we're very interested. As investor-owned utilities, we don't think we need money for the transmission system. We believe that there is plenty of capital out there to build it. The co-ops and APPA will have different views on that. We really need the policies right on siting and permitting, FERC relationships with return on equity, and of course the cost allocation issues, as well as siting and permitting, need to be fixed to really build out the transmission system. So we, along with many other entities, signed a letter with the Gridwise Alliance asking that in any infrastructure bill, $50 billion be targeted toward the grid, and that includes the distribution system. If people are interested, I can get that letter to the S&C team. You can take a look at it. So the distribution grid, at least from our perspective, is one that needs to be focused on in any infrastructure package. The third area is tax policy. And again, Phil mentioned it earlier, the green tax measure that Senator Wyden is pushing, and we're generally very supportive of that. The one area that we feel needs to still be included is a production tax credit for existing nuclear so that we can keep those carbon-free resources on the grid. But some people would say we don't really have an energy policy in this country. I would argue we actually do through the Federal Power Act, the Natural Gas Act, and through the tax code. The tax code picks essentially preferred alternatives or resources. And so watching where that tax bill goes is going to be key going forward to the policies that we're talking about. The fourth area is the appropriations process. If you haven't worked on Capitol Hill, it's a pretty big deal. There are about 13 committees, subcommittees that deal with appropriating federal dollars. And that's where a lot of the policies by Congress are funded or not funded to direct those expenditures to the administration. And in that's what I'd like to go briefly to the next set of slides, where we at EEI developed or started something called a Carbon-Free Technology Initiative. And the reason being is that we are on a mission to try and get to net zero by 2050, but there's a lot of technologies that either are in their infancy or they have not been even developed yet that are going to get us across that finish line. And so it's going to be a major area where we need congressional appropriations in this area. We go to the next slide, please. This has been an effort that's pretty wide ranging. If you look at the range of organizations that are involved here, you can see a lot of NGOs on the environmental side, on the industry side. And so we feel that this is something that really has made a lot of progress toward getting into the details of exactly what kind of technologies we need and what should be a priority. If we can go to the next slide, please. So specifically, these are the areas, and you can read them, but they're areas that, again, provide a lot of potential, but are at a minimum in their infancy, and hence the need for R&D investments. Next slide, please. So specifically, not only does the R&D need to happen, then it has to proceed to a demonstration project, deployment, and then essentially making sure that these types of facilities can actually be put in the ground or in the system to get the benefits that they provide. Next slide, please. So again, the point is federal appropriations in this area, they need to be sustained. It's a different way of thinking about this set of issues, and we're going to ask that the money be deployed to get them. Something to watch. I think it's very creative. I'm proud of the team for putting this together. And there are more details if you want to go to the website for CFTI if you're interested. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the whole range of regulatory policy issues, first, I guess I'll start related to the FERC, where I used to serve. There are a number of areas that are worth watching because there is a certain amount of tension between the FERC and state regulators. For those of you who watch it, Order 841 and Order 2222 continue to blur the line between the bulk power system, which is regulated by FERC, and the distribution system, which is regulated by state regulatory commissions. I won't say it's an ugly tension, but the tension is there because FERC has made some decisions that the state regulators would argue have encroached upon their jurisdiction related to the aggregation of storage facilities and distributed energy resources and demand response. And typically or historically, the precedent has been that FERC has allowed states to opt out. In these new orders, they took that option away. And as the president of NARUC, Paul Shalander of Idaho, said, the state regulatory community looks at Order 2222 as a 2x4 across their heads. So that being somewhat in jest, there is a tension there that's worth watching. Also at FERC, as an effort to try and move the transmission set of issues forward, the FERC has set up a joint board between FERC and 10 members of NARUC, and I believe those members will be announced relatively soon, if not tomorrow. It'll be a 3-year project to work through the issues related to that tension between FERC policy on transmission and state policy on transmission. And I mention it because it will have implications. If those relationships can be enhanced between the two sets of regulators, hopefully it will lead to more harmony on how policies impact the distribution grid. And also to watch is something tomorrow. FERC has its July open meeting. There's not another one until September. And there will be policies, according to the agenda, if it doesn't get stricken, on changing the way that FERC is going about transmission planning. Yes, that's transmission, bulk power, not distribution, but it will be significant as we move forward in the debate and the policy development on this set of issues. And finally, I'll go to NARUC and the state commissioners. And when we go forward to fully appreciate what the new distribution grid can provide to customers, we're going to have some major changes in the way that electricity is priced. More dynamic pricing, maybe not real-time pricing, but if we are moving to an economy that has more electrification, you take EVs, for example, I drive 100% EV, we want to make sure that the pricing signals are such that people charge off-peak, and peak has been changing in different areas of the country. Sometimes there's solar overjet in the afternoon, and so that might be the best time to charge. But if we don't have the pricing signals right, you can't blame customers for not responding to them. We have to make sure that those signals are right so that the investments are done in a targeted way that make the most sense to maintain affordability. And we were hoping that with the pandemic, that state commissioners would be a little bit more creative in rethinking how all of their approaches toward pricing and regulatory issues, and to some extent, they have had a chance to do that, but the uncertainty over where the economy is going, in many jurisdictions, there's still a moratorium on shutoffs, which is creating a backload of debt for those customers that has to be resolved. So it's an area that we hope will continue to accelerate in terms of creative thinking. And regulators are not necessarily thought of as creative people. And there's a good reason. They are reluctant given their scope of their responsibility. And if they do something that's somewhat courageous or innovative, rarely do they get credit if it goes well, and they certainly will more likely get the blame if it doesn't. So my ask to people on this call is that as we work on issues related to the distribution grid, first of all, consider the EEI members, our member companies, as the folks who in most cases own and operate the grid. And we want to have partnerships with third parties, particularly approaching the commissions to do more innovative and courageous things. If we're speaking on a more unified voice, the regulators are going to be more amenable to taking some risks and being courageous, whether it's pilot projects or new pricing schemes, because it's going to come down to the regulators approving these kind of investments. They are the ultimate decision makers, and if we don't work together, we have less likelihood of getting these policies moving forward. With that, I will return control to Brian, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks. Well, I will end my screen share here. And if Spencer and Phil Square want to come online, we can talk through maybe some questions that Spencer has gleaned from us during our nonstop rant.
Yes, we've got 15 so far, and I'm hoping we can get some more. Just a reminder to everybody, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom to ask your questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But before we get going, I do want to thank Brian, Philip, and Phil for sharing, your insights today. It's a complex topic, obviously, but I think it's a really important topic to this audience. And I think we have the right people together to kind of provide a unique perspective on that. But with that, I'm going to get started with the first question, which is why the focus on federal solutions versus private? Anybody want to jump at that one?
Well, these are big problems. These are big challenges we're dealing with. And a lot of the mechanisms, a lot of the levers need to be pulled are governmental levers. Now, a lot of energy company regulation happens at the state level, but the reason why we focus today on a lot of federal activity is because we are standing at the precipice of some major federal activity. Joe Biden was elected on a platform that included major overhaul of the electricity system. And we see a lot of activity happening at the congressional level. There are fantastic conversations we could be having about what's happening in Florida or Texas or Virginia or California or Hawaii. But today we're focusing on this level. At the individual level, there are definitely opportunities to participate and increasing opportunities to participate in the market, but a lot of the challenges are structural.
We're talking about a lot of money here at the federal level and policies that, whether we like it or not, are going to be debated that affect the distribution grid. And I want to make sure that at a minimum, Congress does no harm to moving things forward, but also hopefully sees the opportunities, like as I tried to describe in my comments, on where R&D can help not only at the bulk power system, but clearly at the distribution level as well.
And I'd say also that a lot of the policy making that's going on now isn't so much making sure that people have service, but it's where and what types of energy sources are going into the system to ensure a continued and ultimately a zero emissions grid for the nation. So it's not like it was back in the 20s when you were trying to just get wires to everybody. Now it's about what's going into the system and the amount of investment that takes. That's federal scale investment. And I think that there is a role for the states. There is a role for the private sector as well. But the feds are where the money is, and so that's where a lot of the action is.
Thank you. Another question: what are the panelists' take on pushing policy out at the state level rather than the federal level to avoid the bipartisan roadblocks that could be put in place? Would that work to be able to achieve these goals?
Well, hopefully I made it clear that the states are really where the action is, in addition to what we're talking about earlier on federal policy and federal money. And the states are all very different. And as I said, traditionally, we always thought of peak consumption and the need to reduce consumption in the afternoon. But in certain areas, particularly the Southwest with the solar overgen, there's now too much energy going onto the system. And so state policies are going to be the place where the action is, but we have a very diverse country, and regions and states are going to approach this differently for a variety of reasons. And so the states, we've spent a lot of time on state issues, and I'm flying on Saturday to Denver and the summer neighborhood meetings to make sure that we continue our relationships with state regulators, given their importance.
Brian, Phil, anything to add to that?
I'll just add that the states have a very powerful role to play as laboratories, because in addition to their unique physical environments and needs, different states have different interests in terms of economics and policy. So you've got states like New York and Hawaii, for example, trying out performance-based regulation, where they're changing the incentive mechanisms that they are using with their energy companies. There are other states that are focusing more on, hey, we're going to do a lot of undergrounding of lines. We're going to do a lot of hardening of poles. So from a regulatory and a technical perspective, the different states trying different things actually gives us great data on what's going to work and what's not going to work, because all the other states are watching. And as they watch and as they go to the NARUC meeting where Phil's going to be next week, sorry, Phil, I'm not going to be able to see you there. But as they go share those best practices, they can say, hey, this is really working for us. Here's how it might work for you. So the states are very important.
Excellent. So simple enough question, but I think it's going to be a complex answer. Most utilities have already implemented automation. Is more necessary?
Well, I guess I'll jump in. I think we've made incredible strides on the amount of smart meters in this country, but we still have a ways to go, and some states still have not approved them, and so that's a bit of a patchwork, but the momentum's incredible. I think we've got over 110 million in now. I'll check my figures on that. I think the challenge, and Brian referred to it in his presentation, is now that we have smart meters, we have all this data, what do we do with it? How do we manage it? How do we make it so that customers can use that data in ways that make sense to them, and frankly, can be monetized by some of our energy companies in ways that, again, if you use it right, you can shift load from higher peak times to, say, the middle of the night when the wind is blowing. You've still got that infrastructure in place. It's kind of a win-win-win. You get more revenue through the system. You're not burdening the system with peak, and people are hopefully happier with more of electrification, whether it's their vehicle or other areas. But again, it goes back to, you need the regulatory policies and the pricing policies to encourage customers, even when we use that data, to act in ways that are beneficial to them and society as a whole.
Also, the term, you use the term grid automation, which could mean a lot of things. The term smart grid, we throw that around like candy. It can mean a lot of things. The fact of the matter is both of these terms are evolving. What we can do and what we must do to leverage all of our capabilities on the grid is a moving target. And so as we think about the new opportunities we have to leverage our grid, our understanding of what capabilities we need is going to evolve. So I would say that there is absolutely zero number of energy companies out there today that couldn't benefit from further modernization of their grid, where their customers wouldn't have a very cost-effective benefit from that investment.
Got it. All right, so we've got a lot of questions and we only have about 6 minutes left. And so I want to kind of try to summarize one big question we kind of we've gotten them multiple times in lots of different ways, which is essentially, how is it that it seems like our audience and our panelists are seeing that there's this gap between, I guess I'd say it, policymakers and government officials understanding the importance of the distribution, or really the energy grid as a whole, and the decisions they're making and pushing. How do we close that gap? How do we make it so they understand that we need to plan an infrastructure for the next 100 years and things like that? What are we missing that's not making this something that is a high priority?
I guess I'll jump in. The average state regulator serves for 3 years, and most of the time they come from outside the industry, a lot of times from the legislature. And so it's our job, certainly at EEI, but also I think through the whole industry, is to truly educate state regulators on the basics of the distribution grid. And one of the best ways to do that is to show them how it works. And I remember bringing a bunch into, we had a neighborhood meeting out by Palm Springs. We brought them into the SoCal Edison distribution system, frankly, to show them the lack of visibility of that system and the need for the visibility, so that as the distribution system evolves, becomes more complex, more two-way power flows, two-way information flow, the Internet of Things being connected, that they understand that, roughly speaking, in this new grid, we're going to need the same kind of visibility we have at the distribution level that we have at the bulk power system, which is extensive, and it's going to take money. But that's what's going to be necessary to not only get all the benefits of this, but also assure reliability. We briefly talked about cyber threats, but reliability has to remain paramount. And that's going to take the investments, again, to get the visibility into the distribution system.
Phil Square, do you have additional thoughts on that topic?
Well, I think to build on what Phil said, that it's always a challenge, no matter what you're talking about. This is such a big country, and it is such a complicated economy, and the products that we have are very sophisticated. Members of Congress or members of legislatures or policymakers, no matter where they are, the benefits of getting them out of their offices and into a facility or in front of a product or something like that can't be overstated. And so any opportunity to reach out to mayors, city councilmen, utility commissioners, congressmen, anybody in government with responsibility over your industry or your products or your facilities, you owe it to them to reach out and educate them about what you do and how you do it and why it matters, not only to your customers, but to them. So, I've cut my teeth on Capitol Hill, and so I've been on my share of plant tours, and I've also conducted my share of plant tours. And the relationships that come out of those the value of those meetings cannot be overstated. And so I would really encourage anybody that has a chance to do that. That's the only way that these people are going to learn the value of what's going on in their jurisdictions, is by seeing it and touching it and getting some focused time with companies.
Excellent. Maybe Phil Square, another one for you. What resources do you feel the government needs to provide to facilitate the investment in the distribution grid? Beyond money, obviously.
I was going to say it's a green policy, right?
Beyond money, I think the question is more geared towards what additional resources could be provided beyond funding.
Right. I think you see some of the challenges when we're talking about FERC taking on a transmission incentives rulemaking coming up. You have people coming in from all sides, the NIMBY crowd that doesn't want transmission. You have the states that are worried that their renewable resources are going to be sent to the city 2 states over. You have the people that are trying to build equipment and systems and want to get on with it now because the investments dying on the vine or what have you. That if we could get everybody in the room and say, okay, is there a value here to reliability and certainty of electricity supplies? We got to have a little bit of this, we've got to have a little bit of that, and we've got to have a lot of care as to where these systems are installed or constructed that kind of convening power, I think, is really important if we're talking about a national approach to a 21st century grid.
So we're right at time. So I'm going to go ahead and say that, I'm going to leave it to our panelists to answer one question, which is kind of twofold. One is, simply put, do you believe that federal policy is ignoring the distribution system or the distribution grid? And then finally, and if you can keep it to 30 seconds or less, what do you want our audience, the folks who attended today, what can they go do from this discussion? What can they go do to affect this change? Phil Square, you want to start us off?
Yes, I guess the first thing that I would like the participants to do is to begin that communications process with identify who makes decisions at the state, local, county, jurisdictional, federal level, and find a way to coordinate with your competitors, if possible, or with your industry associations, or with other people you may know, and preach the gospel of what we've been talking about for the last hour. These people want to do the right thing. They have to hear from your perspective if you want them to do the things that you think they ought to do. And so they need to hear that. And so I would start with that. I would join associations. I would join professional associations, find out how you can get the word out, and really make a conscious effort to do that.
Phil Moeller, you want to go next?
Well, I completely agree with Phil's point on what we talked about earlier, getting involved, showing regulators, legislators, the system, because frankly, it's been so reliable, people have taken it for granted, but it's going through a big change and there are trade-offs involved there. Regarding the first question, do I think it's ignoring the federal policy, just ignoring the distribution side? Well, to some extent, distribution is not getting the same attention as federal issues in the bulk power system. But as I mentioned also, the Gridwise Alliance and our efforts there are an effort to make sure that Congress does focus at least some of their attention as policy moves forward on the importance of the distribution side.
Brian, you want to round us out?
Yeah, I will say short answer, yes, it is not getting the attention it deserves. And in terms of what folks are going to do, we are all called upon to be stakeholders at various times, to give feedback and things like that. And when you hear these proposals about we're going to do this with energy storage, we're going to do that with solar, we're going to do this, I think that the response should always start with, that's great, but how? And just make sure that we never let folks off the hook with the, how are you going to incorporate these solutions into the energy grid? Because if we always focus on that, we will always keep a keen eye on the fact that you need a nervous system with which to attach all of these great things that we want to accomplish. Thank you, Spencer.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, again, I know we went a little long, but before we wrap up, I wanted to remind everybody we'll be sending a recording of this webinar to everybody who attended. In addition, when you leave this webinar, we'll be sending out a 1-question survey. Really love any feedback you could provide. But with that, I want to thank Brian, Philip, and Phil for their time today. And to all of our attendees, on behalf of S&C, thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us. We hope it was valuable for you, and we hope to see you again in the future. Thank you so much.